Welcome back to Weighed in the Balance, the show where we examine to see if claims can hold up to scrutiny. Today, I really want to get through this Joe Heschmeyer video where he rates what are, in his opinion, the best and worst arguments for Roman Catholicism. Now, I'll be honest, I've been a little bit disappointed in Joe thus far, just because I haven't really... I suppose there's been one or two arguments that he's mentioned that I've been like, yeah, that's a bad argument. Though, ironically, it hasn't always lined up with his tiers. Like, one of the arguments that I saw as one of the worst arguments against Roman Catholicism, he actually put in his highest tier, and that was lukewarm Catholics, because I don't think lukewarm Catholics are an argument against Roman Catholicism any more than I would think that a lukewarm Presbyterian would be an argument against Presbyterianism. The truth claims themselves are not dependent on the people who profess them. But then one in his lowest tier, the literally fake tier, I actually don't think is literally fake. I think he's just misunderstanding what we're saying. And I think also he is perhaps getting offended at the fact that we are saying that the Pope is the Antichrist. And that's something that I understand, but also it is not therefore a reason to abandon something that is true. Because the Greek preface anti can either mean against or in the place of, and the Bishop of Rome does set himself up in the place of Christ. Nevertheless, it is true that not every argument against Roman Catholicism is a proven winner. Not every argument is equally persuasive. Not every argument is equally valid. And so let's take a look at what Joe has to say and see where we agree and where we disagree. This is also a good exercise just for us trying to formulate our arguments, and that is, how are these arguments heard by the other side? So let's see what Joe has to say.
Know you're going to pass no matter what, you maybe don't try your hardest. So there's probably a reason why Jesus, when pressed on questions like how many will be saved, stresses try really hard and basically assume that it's really hard to be saved. And then he deflects.
All right, so what he's talking about here is an argument that we actually dealt with last week, the assurance of salvation argument. And go back and watch that video. I talked about how he's really conflating once saved, always saved with Roman Catholics do not have assurance of salvation. You do not have to hold to a once saved, always saved position, where the Reformed actually hold to what's called the perseverance of the saints, which is not the same as once saved, always saved. But Lutherans as well that don't hold to perseverance of the saints can likewise make this critique. So go back and watch that video if you want to see my response to this line of argument that he's utilizing right here.
Giving a lot of personal details about exactly how many or questions like that. All right. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Here's a good flimsy argument. The whore of Babylon. Now, the argument here is the Roman Catholic Church is bad because the whore of Babylon is Rome. And you might say, why is that not just in the literally fake? Well, because there's a sense in which it's right, but it's just conflating Rome. So I really dislike when Protestants who want to be taken seriously refer to Catholics by some pejorative instead of saying Catholics. They'll say like, oh, Romanists or Papists or Rome. Sometimes Roman Catholic isn't pejorative in the same.
All right, so let's talk about why someone might refer to a Roman Catholic, which that's the term that I normally use, a Roman Catholic. Why would someone refer to a Roman Catholic as a papist? This has actually come up once or twice in the comments. Ironically, as I was explaining why I don't normally use the term papist, at least when I am talking with someone who is Roman Catholic. I will say Roman Catholic. I won't say Catholic. I will say Roman Catholic, and the reason is because my church every Sunday confesses I believe in the Holy Catholic Church. Now, I have had some Roman Catholics say it doesn't matter if you confess that. If you aren't in communion with the Roman Pontiff, then you're not part of the Catholic Church. And that is the very point that is under dispute, which is why I won't grant the name Catholic to Roman Catholics. Now, why would we refer to Roman Catholics as papists, which I don't in principle have a problem with? My own confession of faith refers to Roman Catholics as papists. I avoid that term when talking with Roman Catholics so as not to offend, but why would someone use it? Well, what is the defining characteristic of a Roman Catholic? It is submission to the Roman pontiff, that is, the Pope. So, a Roman Catholic is a follower of the Pope, or a papist. And you can even see this in the common rejoinder to that has been leveled at me again in the comments is, well, how do you know that I'm a Roman Catholic? How do you know that I'm not an Eastern Catholic? Well, it's irrelevant, because you can have an Eastern Catholic, so-called Byzantine Catholic, that has the same theology as the Eastern Orthodox, and I've seen interviews where they went down through like filioque. Oh, well, they don't make us say the filioque. Okay, well, what about original sin? Well, we have a different understanding. What about the Immaculate Conception? Well, we're not in principle opposed to it, but we just don't use that terminology. Well, what about, right? And they'll go down through even with substitutionary atonement. When the guy was asked, what about substitutionary atonement? He literally said, what's that? So this, and granted, this is one priest, all right, I'll grant that. But this Byzantine, it was actually a, oh goodness, I believe he was Melkite. It was the Antiochian Orthodox equivalent that submits to the Roman pontiff. This Eastern Catholic priest was, by all of his theology, perfectly in agreement with this Antiochian Orthodox interviewer, and yet he is an Eastern Catholic because he submits to the Roman pontiff. In the same way, you will have Western Rite Orthodox that go down through every one of those, and, for example, substitutionary atonement, which, if you don't know, the Eastern Orthodox reject. He'll say, well, and again, you can look this up. I believe this is in an interview that this gentleman did with Michael Lofton. He said, look, people have misunderstood Anselm. When they argue against substitutionary atonement, they're arguing against Calvinists. They're not arguing against St. Anselm. He actually referred to the Immaculate Conception of Our Lady, right? And just on all of these points, he's in perfect agreement with his Roman Catholic interviewer, but he doesn't submit to the Pope, and therefore he is Western Rite Orthodox, not Roman Catholic, even though in theology they were virtually the same. So that's why we use the term papist in, for example, our confessional documents, is because that is the defining factor. It's not actually an insult. It is accurately describing what makes a Roman Catholic a Roman Catholic. Now, since I interrupted him, I'm going to back this up just a bit here.
Sometimes Roman Catholic isn't pejorative in the same way the others are, but it's not usually the way Catholics describe themselves. It's much more like a way Protestants who don't want to say Roman Catholic, or who don't want to say Catholic Church, can get away from that, because they don't want to say we're Catholic, because then what does that make you? Again,
that's the point under dispute. The Roman claim is that the Church Catholic is synonymous with the communion of those who are subject to the Roman pontiff. And so it is not an insult. It's simply not granting the Roman Catholic premise.
I don't hear them saying like, oh, we can't say the Orthodox Church, because then we'd be saying we're heterodox. Like, people understand what a name.
Actually, I insist on saying Eastern Orthodox Church, so it is a consistent standard.
Name is, but fine. You know, I can talk about the Disciples of Christ as a denomination, and I'm not saying I'm not a follower of Christ. So I think it's a complete, like, it's a very strange sensitivity from some Protestants. But as a result, they just won't use our actual name. They'll say Rome. And this is often the people who have like the biggest beef with the Catholic Church. And here's the problem. When you read Revelation, the Whore of Babylon is identified with like the 7 hills of Rome. And this seems to be a reference to the city of Rome and or the Roman Empire. And so they'll say, aha, it's Rome. And since they've been calling the Catholic Church Rome, they kind of conflate the two. This is a weird argument. No, I've pointed out before, I think 1 Peter 5:13, where St. Peter writes from Rome, is clearly a reference to him, excuse me, from Babylon. He says, you know, she who is at Babylon, in reference to the church at Rome. It shows that you can make this connection between Rome and Babylon. But notice, he doesn't refer to the Christian church in Rome as just like Rome. It's the church of Rome, or the church in Rome. And that's still true. Like the Roman Catholic Church, we prefer to just call it the church. If you want to say the Church of Rome or the Church in Rome, fine. But hopefully you get the idea that.
Exactly. He would refer to just call it the church, and that is the point under dispute. What about this whore of Babylon argument? It's not a good argument, because when you understand the book of Revelation and what the quote-unquote whore of Babylon is, yes, it is typified by Rome and the decadence of that city at the time when John was writing. But what was Rome at the time that John was writing the book of Revelation? It wasn't the seat of the papacy. There was no papacy yet. Instead, Rome was the seat of the empire and the seat where either Nero or Domitian was reigning, depending on the dating that you take of the book of Revelation. And what was the Roman Empire defined by? Decadence, immorality, drunkenness, orgies, right? You can go through all of the vice lists that the writers of the New Testament list in the New Testament. They are taking the sins of the Greco-Roman culture of their day when they make those vice lists. And so why is Rome personified as a prostitute riding on a beast, which the beast, by the way, there is a connection there with the beast that is persecuting the Christian church earlier in Revelation. But why is Rome personified by a prostitute? Well, it's because that is the sin that defined that culture. So I actually will go a step further than Joe and say this one isn't flimsy. This one is literally fake. Now, that being said, at times, could the Roman Catholic Church have been a manifestation of this whore of Babylon? Because, again, it is typified by Rome in the book of Revelation. Rome is the manifestation of that prostitute in John's day, just like Nero or Domitian was the manifestation of the beast in John's day. But have there been other beasts? Of course. You can look around right now. I'm not going to name names, but there are anti-Christian governments persecuting God's people today, saying, bow the knee to us, or, well, you know what the consequences are. Now, just as Nero and Domitian were not themselves, and by the way, Nero in the book of Revelation is clearly who John is drawing on. It's just a matter of whether Nero was still alive at the time when John wrote. I tend to think he probably wasn't. It was probably later on, but some people think that he was. Nevertheless, Nero is the guy that John is very clearly in this vision. He's seeing things that would make you think of Nero. But just as Nero or Domitian or Diocletian are not the only, they're not the beast in the sense of that's it. In the same way, Rome and Roman culture and Roman decadence at that time is not the be-all, end-all of the whore of Babylon either. And there have been times throughout history when, especially the medieval popes, did personify this. Now, that is not an argument against Roman Catholicism per se, because, well, in the medieval church, there was no Protestant church, right? This is an example of wolves in sheep's clothing coming into the people of God, right? Fulfilling Paul's words to the Ephesian elders that from among your own number there will come wolves in sheep's clothing. So I suppose in that sense, it's not literally fake, but to say, well, today you can't be Roman Catholic because Rome is the whore of Babylon, that's not an argument against Roman Catholicism. When you understand what John is talking about, it is not an argument that I would recommend using and an argument that I would commend.
Those are not the same entity as the church. And obviously, right, like once you recognize that, hopefully you can see, yes, it's true, the whore of Babylon can be identified with Rome, but if you're conflating the city and the empire and the church, that would be like calling the Sanhedrin and the Christians Jerusalem and just combining all of that, and it'd be a mess. Or I guess maybe to take a more real example, sometimes the term Israel is used to describe the church. Sometimes Israel is used to describe like the plot of land or even the people who don't convert to Christianity. You've got to make those distinctions and can't just say, well, Israel is Israel is Israel. That doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. Last point.
I agree. I am actually glad that Joe and I have found something that, even though he doesn't even know we're having this dialogue, nevertheless, I'm glad that Joe and I have found something that we can agree on. You do have to make distinctions when you come to the text of Scripture, and it is interesting that he expects you to be able to do that.
On that, remember the 7 hills of Rome? Vatican City is not within the old city of Rome. It's on Vatican Hill, which is not one of the 7 hills. So when the Whore of Babylon is identified as on the 7 hills, that actually shows it's not the Roman Catholic Church, but that's, there you go. All right.
And we were doing so well. That last point really is irrelevant. Whatever.
Let's see a good fake argument. How about this one? Millions killed in the Dark Ages. Now, anytime people talk about Dark Ages, it is cringeworthy because this is Enlightenment propaganda. The people who called themselves the Enlightenment because of how smart they thought they were and how dumb everyone who came before them was. I find those arguments to be pretty bad already. But additionally, the people claiming millions, I've even seen hundreds of millions of, Bible believers were killed by the Catholic Church. They literally were not. And when you think about how many people were alive in Europe at various points in pre-Reformation history, the numbers are so low of even how many people are in, Western Christendom, say, that they literally could not have done that. Speaking of literally fake arguments, how about Catholics added books to the Bible?
All right, so obviously I'm going to disagree with his next one, though maybe not in the way you would think. But on the millions killed in the Dark Ages, I actually don't see that as an argument against Roman Catholicism per se. That could be an argument against conflating church and state, and an argument for recognizing what in my tradition we referred to as the spirituality of the church, that the state has been tasked with things temporal and the church has been tasked with things spiritual. So the state has temporal jurisdiction and is given the sword, and the church has spiritual jurisdiction and is given the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And so those are 2 separate realms, and while granted God's word does have things to say about how the civil realm is to be governed, and so in that sense the church does have things to say to the civil magistrate, it is a separate jurisdiction. And in the Middle Ages you didn't have that, and actually going into the time of the Reformation you didn't have that. That being said, his criticisms of the Enlightenment, I think, are fair. What was the ultimate Enlightenment endeavor? It was the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, I have nothing good to say about it. Now, I also, maybe I walk that back a bit. There certainly is not much good you can say about the Ancien regime in France and the arguments of Alexis de Tocqueville that most of the things that defined it really did need to go away. And so in that sense, the revolution doing away with, for example, venal office, the fact that you could just buy an office in government, and the fact that, certain rich families would sort of treat the bishoprics as a kind of venal office, right? I'm going to butcher this guy's name because I know it in English and not in French, but it's a guy named Talleyrand, who ended up being excommunicated and I think was an atheist, or if not an atheist, at least a very skeptical deist, but was for a while, and at the time of the outbreak of the French Revolution, he was a bishop and was actually elected to the Estates General as a delegate of the First Estate from where he was the bishop. Well, that's the kind of thing that needed to go away now, isn't it? Now, the revolution also ended up elevating a guy like Talleyrand to where he was sort of the kingmaker and ended up being the power behind the scenes all the way through the elevation of, I think, Louis Philippe to the throne of France. He was still kind of scheming to bring down the last king of France, Charles X, and that happened in 1830. So from 1789 all the way through to 1830, Talleyrand is kind of there, and he leaves for a little while and goes to America and then comes back. He was actually, if you remember learning about the XYZ affair in school, that was because Talleyrand wanted a bribe, right? So it's not that even the good that the revolution brought about, things like doing away with these bishops that really don't actually believe anything. Well, one such bishop just ended up becoming like a leading statesman, so it's not like it changed everything. But this Enlightenment philosophy that was behind guys like Robespierre, well, the Enlightenment philosophy that influenced him so much taught him what? Well, it taught him that man is fundamentally good. And so that meant that if there were unvirtuous people in society, they needed to be purged from society because man is fundamentally good. And so if you are corrupting society, then that's where you get the Great Terror, right? So I am not of the opinion that the Dark Ages were so bad and the modern ages were so good. No, people are sinners, actually. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And in fact, people are going to be sinners in every age. So I actually will agree that that is a bad argument. So look at us. Joe and I are agreeing on so much today. I have a feeling we are about to disagree.
It's also just literally untrue. So the argument goes, there used to be a Bible with 66 books, and then in response to the Reformation, 7 books were added. No, that's a lie. It's a falsehood.
Okay, that is untrue. What is true, and we'll see how close to this Joe actually gets when he lays out the case. I have a feeling he'll be a little bit different. But what is true is that in the early church, there were some people who accepted what would be equivalent to the 39-book canon that Protestants accept today. And there were some people who accept the 7 additional books that the Roman Catholics have in their Bibles. Just a couple of witnesses in my defense of my position. You have Athanasius. If you read his 39th Festal letter, when he talks about the Old Testament and the canon there, he argues that there had to be a 22-book canon of the Old Testament because the Hebrew alphabet had 22 letters, and so it had to be a 22-book canon. Now, whether that is a good argument or a bad argument is irrelevant, because Athanasius held to a 22-book Hebrew canon, which is the same as the 39-book Protestant canon of the Old Testament. Now, you may be thinking, how on earth is that the case? Well, Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel was 1 book. 1st and 2nd Kings was 1 book. 1st and 2nd Chronicles was 1 book. And then the 12 minor prophets were the book of the 12. I think Jeremiah and Lamentations was also 1 book. And so there are books that get combined, whereas in modern Bibles, they get separated out. And so in Protestant Bibles today, Samuel and Kings and Chronicles and the minor prophets are all separate books, whereas in the Hebrew canon, I actually have it right here, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. You just open this up to the table of contents, and you have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the Book of the 12, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ruth, Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah. That's 1 book. So it's not that Jeremiah and Lamentations, was combined into 1 book. I misremembered that. It was Ezra and Nehemiah are combined in 1 book. And then Chronicles. All right, so actually in this BHS, it's 24 books, but I think if I remember correctly, I know that the 22-book canon is synonymous with the Protestant canon, and I believe that so Esther, I think, was also combined with Ezra and Nehemiah. All right, so I found it now. So Judges and Ruth is 1 book, Samuel is 1 book, Kings is 1 book, Chronicles is 1 book, Ezra and Nehemiah are 1 book, and the 12 minor prophets are 1 book. So in BHS, they are not combined as they were in the 22-book Hebrew canon that is cited by Josephus. And forgive me, I don't have all of this right on the top of my head. However, because you're getting a completely cold reaction here from me, but what I do remember is Athanasius argues for a 22-book Hebrew canon, and that is not the same, as he actually excludes what's called the Deuterocanon. Jerome likewise held to that 22-book Hebrew canon, and through the Middle Ages and all the way up to the time of the Reformation, there was a minority position that held that the Deuterocanon was not on the same level as the rest of the canon of the Old Testament. That is important to note, that up until the Reformation, it was at least a tenable position to reject the canonicity of those books. That is not, so in one sense, it is literally fake to say, well, prior to that, there was a 66-book canon, and after that, there was a 73-book canon. That's not that would be a literally fake argument. However, it is equally literally fake to say, well, this is the Bible that everyone had, because it's not. There was a minority position that rejected those books. Now, I know that Joe is going to cite the Roman Catholic myth, and I will just call it a myth, that says that Jerome, once the church had spoken, he accepted the Deuterocanon. No, he didn't. And there's been long back and forth between Joe Heschmeyer and his friends and Dr. Gavin Ortlund, demonstrating that I think Dr. Ortlund demonstrates very well. It's a little bit of a complicated issue, but he does demonstrate very well that no, Jerome did not accept the canonicity of those books. Let's let Joe get to the end of this argument, though.
Easy to point out that it's not true. You can find any number of early church sources, the Third Council of Carthage. You can look at the Latin Vulgate. We have literal biblical manuscripts that you can look at and see that it's not true. The Council of Florence affirms that there's a 73-book canon. And what the Council of Trent does is just reaffirms what had already been believed, but includes an anathema and defines it infallibly. Okay. So then people say, well, okay, so, you still didn't have it infallibly defined until Trent. But now you've changed the argument from you added books to the Bible to you didn't add books in the Bible, but your Bible wasn't infallibly defined. Protestant Bibles today aren't.
Protestant Bibles today are not infallibly defined. That is a good point. We should be careful in what we say. It is not the case that Rome added books at Trent. It is the case that Rome was wrong at Trent. And there is a difference. We hold that the minority in the early church and through the Middle Ages was correct, then the majority was wrong. And because we don't do theology by democracy, I think it's a solid argument. You probably should not use the Roman Catholics added books to the Bible at the Council of Trent. It is more complicated than that.
Infallibly defined, that doesn't mean that they don't have 66 books.
That is a big admission that he will. I'm having trouble believing he just said that. Protestant Bibles are not infallibly defined. That doesn't mean that they don't have 66 books. Roman Catholic Bibles were not infallibly defined until the Council of Trent, but they still had the canon. That is a huge admission, because what is the biggest argument, the one that they always go to in the Sola Scriptura debate is, well, how can you have the canon? You need the canon to be infallibly defined. Well, you didn't for 1,546 years, give or take.
The Catholic Bible before Trent wasn't infallibly defined, but people knew how many books that it had. So it's just not a true argument. Okay, let's go back up to the top and think of a good argument. Marian dogmas as...
That really is amazing. I think I'm just going to leave it there. I don't want to hear... I really don't want to hear Joe Heschmeyer talk about the canon anymore in Sola Scriptura debates, because he just admitted that you don't need an infallible declaration of the infallible Magisterium to have the canon. My goodness, does he even realize what he just said? Roman Catholics had a true knowledge of the canon before they had the infallible declaration. Protestants have a real knowledge of the canon now, even though we don't have an infallible Magisterium. That is amazing. Thank you so much, Joe Heschmeyer. I want to clip that and use it so much. Oh my goodness, that's amazing. And this is why it pays to listen to what the other side says, because sometimes it's like, because he's responding to an attack on the Roman position and his problems with that phraseology aside, you all know what I mean. Because he's responding to a critique on the Roman Catholic position, it's like his defenses are down a little bit, and he admits what Roman Catholics never want to admit, and that is that you don't need infallible certainty to have knowledge of the canon. That is awesome. Thank you so much, Joe Heschmeyer. And thank you all for watching. I appreciate every one of you that actually watches these videos, and especially those of you that make it this far in. Thank you so much. I know that your time is valuable, and I know that there are many other things that you could be doing. So thank you so much for watching this video. I would greatly appreciate it if you would like and subscribe if you haven't already. And let me know in the comments what you thought about this video. As always, guys, thank you once again, and I'll see you next time.